Well, Yves, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you for having me.
We're really privileged to talk to you. So while we don't really know if the victims in the shootings participated in sex work themselves, the shooter targeted them at spas and massage parlors where they worked and reportedly talked about eliminating temptation. So can you explain the intersection between massage parlors and sex work and how you're thinking about that and responding to the event?
Sure. So, partially, we have to acknowledge that some people who work in massage businesses do engage in sex work. Some of these businesses do offer like sex trade services. And it would be irresponsible to not really acknowledge that because it's true. And also, even if they engage in sex work or like sell sex in some of these businesses, or some people in the businesses themselves, right, do sell sex individually as people who work in these massage businesses, they might not self-identify with the term of sex work. Sex work is a political term. And so they might not identify with that. They might not want to talk about it. And so that is an acknowledgement that we have to make. But also that even if they didn't engage in sex work and they never sold sex, even if these businesses never advertised these services, they are linked to sex work and are harmed by the expansive harms of the criminalization of sex work. And we keep saying this, but even if they didn't engage in sex work, the racialized and gendered assumptions that are made about these women and about where they work and the fact that they're migrant Asian women made the killer think that they were.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in response, I guess, in the last week or so, and even before that, police departments across the country in New York and other cities have been vowing to increase their presence in AAPI communities as a response to the shooting and the rise in hate crimes overall. How do you feel about that response broadly?
Awful. So the police are not a solution at all. In fact, are very much so a part of the problem. Police are themselves a lot of violence, and we think that the criminalization is violence itself, and a lot of problems stem from this criminalization, which is of course linked to the police. Police are often people who exploit these massage workers, who often exploit sex workers, especially if they're vulnerable, if they're undocumented migrant women who work in these places. They are often exploited. They are asked to comply with the police, and if they don't, then they suffer even greater punishment at the hands of the police. They have been assaulted by the police. We don't think that they're a solution at all. And also, as a part of talking about it, right, our goal is for the decriminalization of sex work, and that's not going to happen as long as the police exist.
Right.
That makes a lot of sense. And, it's not like hate crimes overall are a new thing. So I don't know why we would have faith that the police could get it right. But, just staying with that topic, can you talk a little bit about how policing has historically affected massage parlor employees or, anyone who's been suspected of sex work, but specifically Asian or immigrant women?
Absolutely. So policing has largely been extremely, extremely harmful, right? While you might hear, and while the police might tell you this, while groups that work with the police, NGOs that work with the police, might tell you that they are trying to address exploitation or they're trying to root out crime, really what they're doing is further harming very vulnerable migrant Asian people, especially Asian migrant women, especially those who are undocumented, by using assumptions that largely try to stereotype Asian migrant women as passive, helpless victims who need rescue, even though what they're doing is definitely not rescuing them, is definitely not providing safety. And they want to control these people and they want to arrest them. And this largely is rooted in a lot of history of hatred for immigrants and hatred for sex workers here in the United States. And you see that, right? The violence that they face. Our organization was created in reaction to the death of Song Young. And she died at the hands of the NYPD, fully because of the NYPD, fully because she was criminalized, was consistently exploited by the NYPD, and eventually died during a raid at her massage business. So you already see the violence that occurs here. And even if they are not just killing people, right? they still indirectly harm a lot of people and indirectly kill a lot of people by arresting them, because we know that prison is a death sentence. We know that when you end up in an ICE detention center, you can become very ill, you can become harmed, they can kill you. And then even then, facing deportation is also violence that happens. And that's what happens to most people who are in these raids at these massage businesses.
And shifting a little bit to some of the legislating that we've seen around this. In recent years, there were some early efforts by some Democrats, like Representative Ro Khanna. He was saying he wanted to reframe laws around sex work to protect the workers rather than criminalize them. There was also this pretty significant discussion around FOSTA and SESTA during the presidential campaign as well. What is the current status around federal legislation on this, and what has been missing in terms of the overall approach?
I mean, what about the approaches? There's nothing. There are currently no protections that exist. Currently, people are still being criminalized. And like I said, it's not really hitting it. And also, there are so many laws, so many crimes that are wrapped up in this, because we keep saying, decriminalization is much larger than just saying that prostitution or selling sex is no longer a crime, because they are going to criminalize specifically Asian migrant women who work in massage businesses, even if they're not prosecuting them for prostitution. Most arrests nowadays, if we look at the NYPD, which is what I'm most familiar with, right? Most arrests that occur in massage businesses are not prostitution arrests nowadays, because they came under fire for that a couple years ago. So now they're arresting people for licensure. They're saying, oh, you're practicing massage without a proper license, and arresting people and then checking if people are undocumented and like handing them over to ICE.
And we're talking to you, after another mass shooting that was a different situation in a number of ways. But I'm wondering how, if at all, gun legislation and the lack of it plays into your advocacy work too. Does that frame the conversation at all in terms of how you think through things?
I mean, obviously it's a part of the conversation, but for me, as a police abolitionist, a prison abolitionist, right? A PIC abolitionist, I don't have the conversation around gun control for individual people in the US, separate the conversation about demilitarization of the police, demilitarization in general for the United States.
That makes sense. So our listeners are very active. They want to be helpful. So, what are some really concrete ways that our listeners can help protect or, stop the stigma, or even, provide for those vulnerable people, who are being, racially or sexually abused?
Well, first, I think that when I say this, I know that a lot of people think that it's intangible, that it's hard, right? But I think that people really have to reckon with some of the racialized and gendered assumptions that they make about Asian women in particular in this case, right? They really have to reckon with their own internalized whorephobia and how they think about sex workers, because a lot of what we've been doing recently is pushing back against the way that people talk about this, because no, we don't know that the women in Georgia who were killed are sex workers, but we do know that they are absolutely harmed by the criminalization of sex work, regardless of whether they engaged in it. And the people who would tell us to not bring that up, or that we're further stigmatizing them, need to consider how they view sex workers, because a lot of the assumptions, right, that people make, or they say, oh, we don't want to victim blame, or we don't want to say this, because if we say that they're sex workers, the underlying assumption is that they deserved it, which sex workers don't deserve violence more than anybody else does. And they didn't ask for it either, right? They are also deserving of not being harassed and not being subject to violence in their workplace. And I really want people to reckon with all of that, and also to be able to hold all of the nuance that this requires, right? You can't just talk about it as if they were just Asian. You can't just talk about it as if they were just women. And also, they weren't just Asian women. They were migrant Asian women who worked in a business that was highly related to the sex trades, right? And this all plays into it. So if you're not doing that work, if you're like a middle class, a upper middle class Asian person who works office job or whatever, right? You cannot fully relate to the experience of these women or other massage workers, and you need to also hold that. And then other tangible things, right, is that massage workers, the very women that we're talking about, other women who are very similar also exist in your community. There are massage workers, there are migrant Asian women, there are Asian sex workers all over the country, in every country, actually, right? In every community, in every city. And people often look away or don't acknowledge it. And I think that you need to like show up and take care of people. You need to develop relationships with people and actually care about them. And it's not enough to do it just now. It's not enough to be a savior and say, oh, I'm going to do this thing right now. Or even like, I'm going to give them a lot of money right now. You need to show up consistently, be community, and actually support people. And that's a really tangible thing that I think people kind of think is very hard. And I've also said this, right? If this moment moves you, then you should study, then you should plug into your local community, find an organization to work with, whether that's an abolitionist organization, whether that's an Asian sex worker organization, whether that's a sex worker-led organization. Find someone, plug in, and if it doesn't exist, then you should create it.
Absolutely. And I think I just want to reiterate one of the points you made because I think it's so important, which is that it doesn't actually matter if these women were sex workers or not, because the stigma that has been placed on these individuals, is the problem. The fact that we are saying, well, it's okay if it was sex workers because they deserve to be, injured or hurt, or the violence against them is something we can turn our, head and look away from. I think that that's something you're absolutely right that we have to, learn to reckon with. So, some of our listeners are learning about Red Canary Song for the first time. I know that I also, just found out about it. I used to be in New York, but I still wasn't as plugged in as I thought I maybe was. So can you talk a little bit about the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, so Red Canary Song, we're a grassroots collective of like at most 10 people, and we work around supporting Asian migrant massage workers in Flushing and sex workers, and we also do advocacy for decriminalization of sex work on a policy level, as well as provide like resources and mutual aid in the community, which in the past year we've leaned in mainly to doing mutual aid. Which makes sense because people are trying to survive. So that's what we've been mainly focusing on for the past year.
Thank you for doing that kind of work.
Yeah, thank you.
Obviously, with all of the violence that's happened, I think it's a really important time to, reiterate what some of the demands that people who work in massage parlors and sex workers have been, advocating for. So can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, so obviously there's diversity throughout the community. Like every sex worker is different and people in different areas of sex work are different. But also specifically when talking about migrant massage workers, the massage workers that we work with here in Flushing specifically just really want basic things, right? Basic survival needs we feel as to have respect for their work, to be protected in their work, to feel safe that they can do their work here without facing violence, and also for the community to stand up for them. This was a very specific demand made by massage workers here in New York that they always give back to the community. They uphold whole economies and the community doesn't support them. And we want people to support them because it's not just violence from like outside people. It's not just violence from the police. It's also the community and also partially, right? Some of those police calls come straight from the community, come straight from their neighbors.
Right.
And so we want to move people so that people in the community would not do that and that they would care for each other.
Yeah. I mean, I think the least people can do is not call the police on something that is, has nothing to do with them and is also not violent or bad or shameful in any way. It's like, stop calling the police on people. How hard is it?
I mean, it is difficult in like the grand scheme of things because so much whorephobia is like baked into the US and also a hatred towards immigrants as well, especially those that are undocumented. So partially, there's so much history of having sex workers be viewed as undesirable, which is really how a lot of people in the community and otherwise view a lot of the Asian migrant women who work in massage businesses, and is also the narrative that is constantly pushed, right? Which makes it a much larger issue that we could talk about for days. But we see calls coming from the community to clean up the streets. We see landlords in the community trying to close down massage businesses because they want to develop new buildings, right? And this also comes straight from people in the community. I really want to highlight that it's partially in that, because I know that a lot of conversation around the police and policing feels like it's just police are completely not a part of the community and that they're whomever and they come in and they do this, which sometimes is true, right? Yeah, there are a lot of police officers who don't necessarily live in that neighborhood that they're policing. But policing is community directed, right?
Right.
People in the community make the call. If they didn't want it, it wouldn't necessarily happen, right? And we employ people. And this is what we're talking about when we see for all of these calls for increased policing. That comes directly from the community, right?
Yeah.
And the truth is that yes, policing negatively affects all of us, is harmful to all of us, right? And is violence towards everybody, but is going to really materially harm specific people and affect the daily lives of the most vulnerable people in our community, which are sex workers, which are undocumented people, which are migrant workers. That's true of every community.
And just to sort of round this out here, this has been a really terrible week after a really scary year of violence, on the rise, targeting Asian Americans throughout the country. You are on the front lines advocating for change here. How are you feeling, and what is helping you stay in this fight, and what would you say to other organizers right now?
Well, thank you for asking. I am very tired and angry, and I've said this in other interviews. It's partially very sad and upsetting that violence towards Asian women necessitates that other Asian women and femmes have to do more labor, and that's upsetting. And I also am partially kind of afraid for what this moment might mean, because of the hyper visibility. It can positively and negatively affect the work. But in this moment, I think that for other organizers who are already doing the work, right, I would hope that everybody is finding time to hold themselves, to hold others in their community, to grieve, whether or not I'm doing that, right? I think that people need to find the time to do that, as it's an active process, an important process to us doing this work, and to try and keep it together, because this work is going to go on for a long time. I know that it seems like we have to do all the work right now, and it seems really important to say all of these things, to take all of the media requests, and to answer all of these calls, but we are going to be doing this work far past this moment. And if you are always trying to get to the roots of violence, the work will be relevant regardless.
Yeah. Wow, that's a word.
That's a really great way to help frame the way that our listeners can think about everything. Well, Yves, thank you so much again for taking the time to talk to us.
Yeah, thank you so much.